Okay, at the end?
When I introduce myself in the beginning, I'll just say when I get to my slides, I'll discuss the timing and the topics of the future COPS webinars, as listed in your on the Tribal Justice website.
All right, so when I introduce myself, and I'll say that I have other colleagues here that will be joining in the presentation.
And then she'll say something about herself, and if she's done, I'll say something about myself.
And then turn it back to me.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to bring everybody in.
After I introduce myself, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Nicholas Birdshead, and I'm the tech support for the OJJDP TTA Center. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. A couple things before we get started. If you have any questions relating to or about any of this presentation, please enter those questions into the Q&A box, which is in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. At the end of the presentation, all questions will be read aloud, and the presenters will answer them. If you have anything to chat about anything, feel free to use the chat box in the lower left-hand corner. The very center on the bottom, it says presentation for download. It is today's PowerPoint presentation. It's also available in PDF form. At the end of our presentation, we're going to have a survey link, and please fill that out. It's a quick survey. It'll just help us with everything going on. And once again, I'd like to thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Williams, and I am from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. Welcome to the Budget Development presentation for the 2018 CTAS Development Webinar process. I am joined here with two other colleagues from the Office of Violence Against Women and the COPS Office, and I'll let them introduce themselves now.
Hi, my name is Suhaila Lasky. I am a financial analyst with the Office on Violence Against Women, and I will provide some little tidbits for our OVW grantees. That's Purpose Area 5. So if you have any questions, just let us know in the question box.
Hello, my name is Bill Faith. I'm staff accountant, and I'm representing the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, also known as the COPS Office. Near the end of the presentation today, I will provide some information regarding the future webinars for Purpose Area 1.
Thank you both for that. Now, this presentation, again, the development of a budget, talks about the budget process and or tools or strategies for completing your budget. Keep in mind that the budget is your best guesstimate as to what you intend to happen over the upcoming year as you're implementing your grant program. So it is very important that you include all conceivable costs that it will take in order to implement your program and allow the individual program officers to analyze those costs to determine whether or not these particular costs, all of the costs that were included in your proposal, are something that can be charged against your federal grant program. To get a feel for some of the things that you'll need during this process, the link above, the justice.gov tribal link, is a link that you want to utilize to find various types of information to assist you with completing your application. You'll find, for example, the 2018 CTAS solicitation. You'll also find a sample budget detail worksheet, which you'll need in order to submit your budget, and the narrative. I want to take this time right now to say that the budget narrative is a very important component of your budget detail worksheet that you submit, because a lot of times just the information or the calculation of the items that's going to be charged against the grant may not give the analyst a full picture of what's going to happen on this particular program. So they will refer to the narrative to give them the additional information that they may need in order to make a decision about that particular funding. I also want to stress that in reference to your budget detail worksheet and the narrative, that represents over 65% of your score for the CTAS budget program. So you really want to spend a fair amount of time on these two items to ensure that you've included or completely filled out everything in these categories. You also find examples of allowable and unallowable costs. You can find acronyms and abbreviations because the federal government is always using acronyms to have conversations between ourselves. So to get a feel for some of those acronyms, you can find that there. And I think another valuable tool you'll see is the frequently asked questions. So let's look at the actual budget categories to give you a feel for the areas that you need to submit information in order to be funded. Personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, subawards or contracts, and procurement vehicles. The other category, because if it doesn't provide you a category that we've just talked about, then naturally it would go into the other category. And then indirect cost. If indirect cost is something that's going to be charged against your particular grant program, again, there's a section in order for you to put in information in reference to your indirect cost. So let's look at each category, starting out with personnel. In personnel, it's always a good decision to, at a minimum, include the position. Okay. In some cases, I've heard grantees say, well, I don't know who will actually be working on this particular program, and that's not a problem. At a minimum, I would need to know the position, and we'll worry about the individual that's actually working it later. Because other information in reference to the title that this individual has and the percentage of time that they're going to be working on this program is something critical for us to know. But let me go back to the position where I said that the individual may not be that important. When we're talking about the person who is responsible for this grant program or key personnel, you want to know or identify who key personnel are on this particular program. And it's also important that if a key personnel leaves during the grant term of that grant program, that you notify the program office of this particular change. Okay. The compensation, normally we like to see the compensation shown in an annual figure in reference to a person is working or their salary represents $60,000, but they'll only be working 50% of their time on this program. So based on that annual salary multiplied by 50% of their time, then that compensation will come out for this grant program to only be $30,000. Keep in mind that if there are any increases, raise cost of living, that you also include these. So that's why I say that you always want to think thoroughly about what's going to be charged against this program and make sure that you've included all conceivable costs when you're calculating your budget. Again, if we're looking at the personnel category, again, the person's name and or positions, the salary that's being charged against this particular program, the rate, and then the years of this particular program in reference to this grant program. Because remember, in some cases, we're only talking about annual funding and or up to 4 years. So again, the most important thing to remember is the budget narrative. The budget narrative provides the analyst with additional information that they may need to understand various costs that have been put in your budget category. So again, you want to be as detailed as possible when you're providing this information in reference to the budget narrative. Next, fringe benefits. Fringe benefits, I've seen them calculated in the budget multiple ways, but the best way to identify fringe benefits is to include all of the fringe benefits and not only as a percentage. We realize that fringe benefits is a percentage of salaries, but again, I need to know what's all inclusive in the fringe benefits package to ensure that there are no unallowable fringe benefits that have been included in the fringe benefits package. Again, some examples of something that may be unallowable is excessive fringe benefits that may be paid to executives within your organization. So again, looking at the actual budget sheet, again, all of the items in reference to the fringe benefits should be listed, their associated base, the rate, and then calculated out. Again, the narrative should reflect the basis of the fringe benefits and whether or not it is a current rate that's being charged against the grant program. Now, this happens to be my favorite category because travel allows you to build in flexibility. I say that for this reason. A lot of times when you're developing your budget, it's hard to determine how much you'll actually incur during this grant program. So you need to be able to build in some type of flexibility. This is one of the categories where you can do that. You can build in flexibility here, but I want you to know that my job is to try to find that flexibility that you put into the application and take it out. So I'll give you an example of what I mean in reference to that. The grant program may require you to do some type of travel that's associated with the grant program. The idea of finding out how much travel in reference to airfare, transportation, shuttle, and per diem and lodging is going to be next year when you actually get this award is hard to determine without making some types of calculations and assumptions about this. So again, this will allow you to determine what the airfare is and possibly add a percentage of increase to it to deal with inflation in order to make sure that you have enough to accommodate yourself next year. So again, you would possibly use some type of travel.com website in order to come up with a reasonable number, but keep in mind that I'll probably use that same travel.com website to determine whether or not the rates or the amounts that you've included are reasonable. Again, you want to keep in mind of all of the costs associated with this travel and include it in there. The most important thing that I'll be looking for in the travel category is what is the agency's travel policy, okay? Because again, the travel policy should not be more lenient than the federal guidelines.
So this is Suhaila, and I have a quick note for our Purpose Area 5 grantees. So the first is that you just want to make sure that you identify the mandated travel as OVW, required travel, and that's so that we can add up all those costs and make sure that it totals the required amount in the solicitation. The next is that local program mileage, it can be requested, but just make sure that you're not putting it towards the required OVW travel total. So if we require $20,000, it has to be strictly for OVW-sponsored training travel and cannot include the local program mileage. And then the last is that if you offer travel vouchers for victims, that those costs are allocated in the other category because this category is strictly just for your internal staff.
Thank you, Suhaila. And again, based on the actual budget category that you're going to use, again, identifying all the travel expenses associated with it, the location that you'll be traveling, mileage and or airfare associated with it, and then the cost associated with that. Again, you want to make sure that with this, you do a budget narrative explaining the nature and the reasons for the trip. Again, like Suhaila mentioned, you want to make sure that if it is related to a specific grant program, that you identify that in the budget narrative. Lodging, there is something that I want all grantees to be mindful of in reference to travel. And this is specifically for OJP-funded contracts. If there will be a conference sponsored by the grant program where there are 30 or more participants, lodging must be at the per diem rate. As you can see, it says that it's for any number of attendees requiring lodging. So here's what I mean by that. Let's just say that you are hosting a conference for 30 or more, and let's just say that that number is 35. Based on that, if one person needs to stay overnight because the other 34 are local people, then that one person is required to get the federal lodging rate. Again, if it is less than 30 people, then this requirement for OJP-funded contracts is exempt. Information in reference to what I just talked about can be found in the DOJ Grants Financial Guide. And for more information in reference to lodging and or per diem, please utilize the GSA website for additional information. Moving next to the category of equipment. The most important thing to remember about equipment is your agency's policy and procedure on how you identify and capitalize equipment. I give an example of what I'm talking about. Most of the time when I think of equipment, I am wearing my federal hat. So the definition for equipment under the federal guidelines is equipment must have a useful life of more than 1 year and have a fair market value of $5,000 and or greater. But depending on your organization's policy and procedures in reference to equipment could be as low as $750 up to maybe $1,000 or $2,000. So again, I need to know what your agency's policy is for equipment, because if not, it is my thinking that it is not equipment, and I will move it out of the equipment category and put it in the supplies category. So again, when we're talking about equipment, you want to identify the unit and the cost and the purpose on how this equipment will be utilized in the grant program. So again, I just talked about this in reference to the definition. It has to have a useful life of more than 1 year and a fair market value of $5,000 or more. Now, the idea of buying equipment to be used on a federal grant program is that we hope that you use the equipment for as long as you need it. When you no longer have a need for that equipment that was brought under the Criminal Justice Purpose Grant program, there are some things that you want to identify to determine how you will dispose of that particular equipment. Again, I encourage you to use it for as long as you have a need for it, but when you no longer have a need for it, if the fair market value is less than $5,000, then you have no more recourse with the federal government. You can retain it, you can obligate it, or you can use it to purchase additional equipment. You can scrap it as long as its fair market value is under $5,000, and there are websites that you can use to find out what the fair market value of equipment is. If that is the case and you document that, then you have no more recourse. However, if the fair market value is $5,000 or more, you must contact the federal funding source and ask for disposition requirements. We will normally say sell the equipment if it can't be utilized by another grant program, a similar grant program, and then send the federal proceeds back to the federal government. So to give you an idea of what I mean when I talk about the federal proceeds, let's just say that your grant program and the CTAS grant programs are that type of program, where the federal government is providing 100% of the fundings for this grant program because there's no match associated with the CTAS programs. So when you sell this particular equipment, then the federal portion should come back to the federal government. However, we do allow a 10%, up to 10% for the grantee to retain, because we realize that getting this equipment up to sell or to get it ready on the market to be sold will incur some type of cost on your side. So you are able to deduct what you actually spent in order to get this equipment ready to be sold, or up to 10%. I will now turn it over to Suhaila to talk about OVW's requirements.
So one note we wanted to include for our Office on Violence Against Women grantees with Purpose Area 5 is that computing devices with an acquisition cost less than your organization's capitalization threshold. So if you follow the same threshold that we do, which is $5,000, so if it's less than $5,000, and regardless of the useful life, you can categorize it as a supply cost. So it doesn't need to be included in the equipment category. And the other note is that if you are including a vehicle, a request for a vehicle, and this also goes for any large cost equipment item, but I would say vehicles are more common. So if you're including the cost per vehicle, make sure to also include as an attached document a lease versus purchase analysis. And what this is, it's a document that you're going to include multiple quotes for both a lease and the purchase for comparable vehicles. So you will include both what you might find for a quote for a lease and then also for the purchase, and a brief analysis comparing the costs and demonstrating to us the most cost-effective measures were taken for the decision that was made. And then if you decide that a lease is the most cost-effective measure, you'll include that cost under the subawards and procurement contracts category, because this section for equipment is purchased equipment. And if you lease, it's a contract, so you'll include it in that category. But one thing I just wanted to note real quick, in one of our previous slides, we had a link for the financial guide, the DOJ financial guide, and I just wanted to note that it has not been updated in the presentation, so Kara has included the link in the chat box, so you can take a quick look there if you need the link to the guide, to the newest guide for 2017.
Thank you, Suhaila. And here is the equipment category. So again, the items that have been identified as equipment, the actual amount that we are planning on purchasing, and then any associated cost. Again, the narrative should detail the reason for the equipment and how it's supposed to be used in conjunction with the grant program. Supplies. Now, again, when we talk about supplies should be broken down to the best of their ability. But we realize that when we start talking about supplies, we may want to group some items of supplies. So when we talk about supplies, they can be broken out in reference to office supplies and or training supplies. But again, based on the amount that we're trying to group together, again, if the amount appears to be excessive to you, and I'll give you an example, because they may not seem excessive to you, but the analysts on the other end may find them to be excessive or require additional information in order to help them analyze it. So let's just say that postage, you have a line item for postage and it's for $10,000. I would say you would probably want to include some additional information to explain why postage is so high. So some justification for that could be that we are mailing out quarterly newsletters to people within the community. And we're talking about, let's just say, 1,500 to 2,000 community people and being done quarterly, I think that now I get a better picture as to why postage is so high. So again, when you're looking at any item, not just supplies, if the amount appears to be excessive, you always want to use the narrative to provide the analyst with more information to help them make an informed decision. Okay? How the supplies will affect the actual grant program, and then detailed explanation in the budget narrative if you feel that additional information is needed. I'll now turn it over to Suhaila.
So for the OVW Purpose Area 5 grantees, in this category, just make sure to provide a detailed description of the program-related supplies and how it relates to the program, like why it's necessary. For example, if you have a cost for ribbon shirts and you want to include the cost per shirt, so that we can just make sure that the cost is reasonable. Also in the narrative, a description of what it actually is and how it's used and related to the program, like if it is used by the victims during a ceremonial event as part of their healing process. So just to provide some context as part of the justification is incredibly helpful for us.
And again, looking at the actual category where all this information is going to be, the actual supply items, again, remember, if we do lump some together in the narrative, you want to provide that additional justification, along with the actual number of supply items and its associated cost. Construction category. A thing to remember now that Purpose Area 3, 4, and 9 no longer allow construction. However, renovation is something that's allowable under Purpose Area number 4. So based on an existing building that may need some modification to it, in reference to renovation, that is something that's allowable, and or a prefabricated facility is something that's allowable. Whatever the case is, this needs to be detailed in the application so that the funding source or the program office is aware of all the things that it's going to take in order to renovate a building or your decision to use a prefabricated building. Again, not actually again, but I do want to mention this. Even though it's at the bottom of each slide, I want to make reference to this. All costs associated in your budget must be necessary for the grant program, reasonable. So again, you have a responsibility to make sure that these costs that you're including in here are reasonable, that they are allowable under the grant program and allocable. That means consistently treated throughout your organization. So there shouldn't be cost that's treated on a grant program separately from how you treat it normally in your agency. So again, for construction and or renovation, I'll say renovation, all of the details needs to be listed here with all of the items that's going to be necessary in order to renovate a building and its associated cost. The next category, subawards or sub-grants, procurement. One of the things that I think helps us to identify this particular category is that there are two items in this where we run into some problems, where a grantee will submit an application and list a subaward as a procurement vehicle. So at least now there are two separate categories in order to identify subawards separate from procurement contracts. So again, we will look at these contracts or these items that you have under this category to determine whether or not they are listed in the proper category. So again, if we're talking about an actual contract or consultant rate, again, the current threshold of $650 per day for an 8-hour day is something that can be allowable. However, just because the threshold of $650 is something that's allowable, I want to say that you should always pay consultants what they're actually worth and not what the funding source will allow. again, if you do business with one particular organization, and you can do that, but the deal is that you have to keep in mind that you have restricted the procurement process of doing what it is designed to try to get multiple offers to give you the values, the term, the best bang for your buck. So I'm not saying that you can't do that, but if you decide to go with one vendor, if that contract is $150,000 or more, you must come into the funding source and get prior approval before starting on that particular sole source contract. Additional information in reference to procurement standards can be found in 2 CFR Part 200, 317 through 326. I will now turn it over to Suhaila again.
So I just wanted to include a reminder, and that's for all grantees actually, that the $650 per day for the consultant rate threshold, that it is just a threshold, and it's not an actual federal contractor rate, but as a threshold, it signifies that anything that's in excess of $650 per day for the 8-hour day, it requires prior approval. So all consultant rates should be determined on a case-by-case basis, consistent with that organization's rate of pay that they've received in the past for providing similar services. And one other note about just making the determination between subawards and contracts, that all contracts, they are generally for when an organization or a company, when they provide a good or service for the recipient organization and not necessarily to carry out a part of the program or project for the grantee. In that case, it would be a subaward. And all contracts are required to follow your procurement procedures, which for the most part do require a competitive bidding process. So that sole source justification is only if it's over $150,000, but still, if you have a contract, if you have, if it's not a subaward and it is a contract, then you are required to follow your procurement procedures, and which generally requires competitive bidding process.
And again, looking at how that information should be displayed in this particular category, again, subawards or subgrants have a section where this information is identified. And again, procurement, there's a section for that. So again, like Suhaila said, you want to determine whether or not we're talking about a true subrecipient and or a procurement or contract nature, and make sure that it is placed in the proper category. And again, a narrative in reference to the actual work that's being performed, the length of that particular contract or that service that's supposed to be provided. Again, additional information that will help the analyst help determine whether or not we're talking about a true subrecipient and or contract. The other category. Based on all the things that we've talked about thus far in this webinar, I normally say that if it didn't fit in one of the categories that we talked about, then naturally it goes in the other category. So again, some of the things that you'll find in the other category could be rent, utilities, and other things that you may find in the other category because they didn't fit in the other category. In some cases, I noticed that things that are in reference to travel, like, say, gasoline and other things could be in here. So, again, I'm not saying that it's not in the right place, but, again, follow your agency's policy and procedures as to where you identify certain types of items. Again, one of the things that I want to bring to your attention is keep in mind that the analyst that is reviewing your application may feel that gasoline goes into the other category or into supplies because they feel that it's a consumable supplies. I would avoid back and forth conversation with them. Your goal is to get your grant application awarded. So again, if they ask you to move something, please move it to that particular budget category. And again, based on any type of narrative to justify where these items belong, and the actual items, again, make sure that you put it in this section associated with all of its cost that's associated with it. Indirect cost category. This is something that can be allowed to be charged back against the grant program. If there is a approved or negotiated indirect cost rate, a federally indirect cost rate from your cognizant federal agency, you want to include that in your application. Again, your indirect cost rate should be current during the time that you're charging it back against the grant program. Again, when I talk about the rates, so you're talking about provisional, final, or predetermined rates that you'll find that'll be a federally approved indirect cost rate. Another thing is the de minimis rate. So if you've never had a federally approved negotiated indirect cost rate, you can elect to charge up to 10% of modified total direct costs without negotiating a rate, okay? You can also use this rate indefinitely and or until you decide to go out and negotiate a rate with your cognizant federal agency. Charges must be consistently charged. So again, whatever you put under the indirect cost category, again, it needs to be consistently charged in your organization as an indirect cost item. Again, here's the category for identifying that indirect cost rate, whether or not we're talking about a federally approved indirect cost rate or whether or not we've elected to charge the indirect cost, the de minimis rate. And again, you need to notify or at least make it explicit in your application that you are electing to utilize the 10% de minimis rate. When everything is done, the budget summary, or you should be able to now look at all of the purpose areas that you are requesting funding for and make sure that all of the items total up and that they are consistent with the detailed information that we just went over above prior to submitting your application for funding. Some reasons why budgets don't clear, and this is important because sometimes you'll submit your application, you may receive something or wonder what the delay is. And here are some of the things that you may want to look at prior to submitting your application and or have someone in your organization review the application prior to submitting it. Some of the things that we find is that the application was submitted without thoroughly complying with all of the instructions in the solicitation. Unallowable costs have been included in the budget detail worksheet. The narrative content is missing or not consistent with the items breakdown that's in the worksheet. And if we're talking about a federally approved indirect cost rate, the agreement was not submitted if you have a federally indirect cost rate. So at this point in time, I'll turn it over to William Faith from the COPS office that will discuss the COPS Purpose Area 1 category.
Thank you, Michael and Suhaila. Hello again, this is Bill Faith of the COPS office. Michael and Suhaila have just provided you with some very good information that will be helpful to you as you proceed through your budget preparation. Most of the information provided here today applies consistently throughout the entire CTAS application. The COPS office will have 2 more webinars, just like this one, where we will go into more details about the programmatic and financial aspects of your CTAS applications. As you see on the screen, I'm showing you the first webinar, and if you are interested in applying for Purpose Area 1 for the COPS office, I highly suggest that you find this link on the tribal.gov webinar site and hit the register link so that you can be registered for this webinar as well, Tuesday, January 23rd at 1 o'clock. These are the key points that we'll be providing, a programmatic and financial overview. And on a second webinar, Michael, go forward one. In the second webinar, we'll be on Thursday, February 8th, and that will be completely geared towards helping you complete your application, the financial aspects of your application. So be sure to register for those as soon as you can. Get on the list there. And the next slide I wanted to provide you with a handful of references. Most of you should already have found the solicitation on the website that's showing. So there's a very important piece of information, a document that you're going to need to read and read again. Make sure that you're understanding the rules, regulations, timelines. There's a lot of information in that solicitation, and it covers all 9 purpose areas. So please, if you haven't, go to the website, bookmark it, even make a download a copy for you if you need to. The second reference, for the COPS Purpose Area 1, we have an allowable, unallowable cost list. It is updated for this year. The third item, the reference to frequently asked questions, the setup for the frequently asked questions. There are generic questions in the beginning, and then they go to specific purpose areas. So if you don't see your question in the first half, keep looking, keep moving forward. They do start with specific purpose area questions, and we're in the middle on pages 21 through 28. So please go to the website and find that resource. I noticed there was a question earlier about the financial guide, so I've added the new link to that, the DOJ Grants Financial Guide. And for those of you interested in requesting indirect costs, I've also added a link to the Department of Interior frequently asked questions for their indirect cost services. So if you would like to utilize that, they're always helpful. So there are just a couple of topics that I wanted to throw out at you. We're going to go into more detail on these during both of the webinars that I just showed you. So the Purpose Area 1 Detailed Budget Worksheet was redesigned to be more user-friendly and to reflect software updates. Most notably, you will find more instructional language throughout the worksheet. I will show you the steps on how to do that. It's simply dragging your mouse over top of any little red icons, any little red triangles, and once you do that, information pops up, instructions on how to use that particular box or section. You're strongly encouraged to use the workbook when completing their proposed budgets. Fillable versions are available for download. There is a question on the board that says where and how. So all of those questions will be answered at the next 2 webinars. I'm going to be giving you a presentation of the new item that we have added this year. Overtime has been added as an allowable cost this year, and it can be requested as a separate item in the other category on the budget detail worksheet. There's a set of questions in the frequently asked questions guide, and they will explain the overtime and how you use it and where you have to report it on. There are caps for that, so keep in mind for COPS office, we will have caps for the amount of funding you get, the amount of overtime you get, and possibly other things that I will discuss on the next webinar. If you plan to request personnel, please read all the award documentation provided, and this is specifically the solicitation, to understand the rules and regulations for hiring the law enforcement in Purpose Area 1. We also offer a civilian position, but it's only for an anti-methamphetamine coordinator. It's the only civilian position we offer. So make sure that you read over the solicitation in our section, Purpose Area 1, to see the eligibility for what a law enforcement officer is. Maintain your documentation that supports how your requested salary was arrived at and how the fringe benefit totals of each item were calculated. Keep a record of that on hand if we need to ask you about how you came up with these numbers. If a request is made for an item that involves policy or procedure, as Michael stated earlier, be sure to state the nature of the policy or procedure. whether it's federal or if it's your own agency policy. Follow those regulations as you create your budget and remain in compliance throughout the award. Some examples that use policy would be for contracting, for consultants, the equipment capitalization, if it's yours or if it's a federal policy, and travel regulations, whether it's yours or it's GSA federal travel regulations. As I said before, be aware of the funding cap for your agency and understand that there is no local match requirement. Please be sure to limit your request accordingly to stay under the cap. If indirect costs will be requested, a current agreement must be submitted with the application. If your agreement has expired, you may present that and submit it with your application. However, the associated costs will be calculated and frozen until a current agreement is provided. This will conclude our webinar today for the budget development section. I'd like to thank you for attending.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Gander Lovell from the OJJDP Training Center here in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. We have about 15 minutes left on the webinar, and so if you have any questions for the presenters, please type them in the question and answer box, and we will begin the question and answer portion of the webinar. Okay, first question. Do you have to do a budget for each purpose area, or do you combine all?
Okay, so when you download the budget detail worksheet, you will notice on that Excel spreadsheet there are 9 different tabs. So you will have 9 separate not even applications. You will have 9 separate budgets to fill out if you want money from every single, if you're going to request money from every single category, every purpose area. So to answer your question, there are separate budgets to be had.
Okay, next question. Is there a list of OVW mandated trainings to help determine location? How many trainings need to be attended?
So there is, this is Suhaila with Purpose Area 5 with OVW, and there is not a list of the mandated trainings to attend. However, if you use the GSA locality per diem to determine the rates that you compensate for travel, then you can use, because it's an estimate, it's a budget, you know, we totally get that, so you can use a large city like Washington, D.C., or like a large city in California to make the budget estimates.
Next question. If we are requesting to host an on-site training, bringing a professional on-site to train in an evidence-based practice, would this cost go under training/travel or contractual?
If you're bringing somebody in to train, then it is, well, at least for the Purpose Area 5, but it is not a direct staff travel, and you are likely not only paying for this person's travel costs, but also their training costs at a consultant, like a consultant's fee. Even if it is a TA provider and they don't have a consultant fee, it's still their travel who's not a direct staff of your organization. So that would be in the contractual category, the subawards and procurement contracts category.
Are wellness court incentives for participants allowable?
That's more problematic.
I'm not sure if maybe the person, if Richard wants to clarify in the box below what purpose area this is for and maybe a little bit more information, we can try to provide some guidance. I just don't know the context. So a little more information will be helpful, but we can go on to the next question in the meantime if Richard wants to clarify.
Next question. For vehicle acquisitions under the COPS Purpose Area 1, will we need to provide a lease versus purchase analysis as described in the OVW Purpose Area 5?
And the answer is no, because you are simply purchasing. You will not be leasing. We don't offer a lease on the Purpose Area 1. But you will need to bring in to the application, if you can get it, a quote or several, and add that to the application. If you're going to be getting a police vehicle and the accessories that come with it, you can combine those two as one cost in the equipment category.
If we have an evaluator who is a consultant to the project, should we categorize them as a subaward of procurement?
I think the question is, or procurement, right, yeah, I think the question is one or the other. I guess it depends on the nature of the service that's being provided by the evaluator. If they're evaluating the program and they're not carrying out a portion of the program, I would say it probably is a procurement. But what I would recommend is visiting 2 CFR 200.330, and that section, it lists out the characteristics of both subawards and contracts so that you can make the determination based off of what the federal regulations actually identify for the characteristics of each. So you can determine based off of that information.
And this is Michael from OCFO, and let me just add to that because I do agree with that. But the thing to keep in mind that I've seen this in 2 different scenarios where we're talking about an evaluator that is evaluating the program during the last 90 days after the grant has closed. So if they're doing it during that 90-day liquidation period after the grant is closed, I would say that that is a procurement contract nature, but also I've seen the case where an evaluator has been evaluating the program, and there may have been dialogue between the applicant and the evaluator throughout the life of the grant. So if that's happening throughout the life of the grant, I probably would reach out to the program manager because that could be a case where that is a subrecipient because it's not at the end of the grant program.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Why does it take so long after award to get your budget approved?
That's a very fair question. Sorry about that, Marilyn. I would say probably because we have such a significant amount of awards that have budgets. I guarantee you that all of our financial staff with all of the components work incredibly hard, and there's always a push to get our budgets done, and we prioritize them all. But we also take such incredible care for each of the budgets to make sure that we are reviewing it very thoroughly from both the programmatic side and financial side from all staff, just to make sure that we're helping to protect our grantees from findings. You know, we look for everything. We incorporate all the different types of reviews into each of the budgets that we look at. So they're really, it's an intensive review for every award, and there's just so many awards that we issue every year and all of the components. So we appreciate your patience as we review the budgets, and sorry that it does take a little bit of time.
Next question, how do we get more information about indirect cost? It's not something that I am familiar with, so I am not sure if it is something that we will need to take into account.
So if you are not with your finance department, I would maybe check with them first and see if they have any, if they've ever looked into it. They might know a little bit more about it. If they haven't, then I would recommend contacting your federal cognizant agency, and that means the federal agency with whom you have the most amount of federal funds. and they'll be able to provide you with more information regarding the process for negotiating a rate. And then if you maybe determine that that is not something you want to pursue, you can also consider, if you've never negotiated a rate for your organization or your tribe, then you can also consider the de minimis rate, which we provided some information for in the presentation.
If your indirect cost rate changes every year in a multi-year grant, do you need to do a GAN budget modification every year that the IDC changes?
So this, I think there is a difference between the Purpose Area 5, which is the Office on Violence Against Women grantees, and OJP. I'm not sure about, okay, and COPS. So I'll speak for OVW, Purpose Area 5. We do not require grantees to submit a budget modification GAN if you are making a change to the, if you're moving funds between the direct and indirect cost categories. That is not a requirement for us. You would defer back to the other things that do trigger a budget modification GAN, but we can, you can see that in the DOJ financial guide, but that is not one that is required for us.
And it is a requirement for the OJP and the COPS grant program. So if you're moving money into or out of the indirect cost budget category, then you must submit a GAN to rebudget those funds so that it can be approved.
And for the COPS office, that is true, but it's not called a GAN. It's a simple modification process through the COPS agency portal. And what you'll do is submit the request, and you will discuss this with your grant program specialist at the time.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Would like to hear clarification about food purchase restrictions for OVW. Can a program's advisory board raise funds to cover this cost since it is not allowable under the grant?
So this sounds like a two-part question. The first one, or I mean, I guess it's one question, but there's, I guess, different ways to approach it. So the first thing I want to clarify is that if the food costs are for victims and survivors, like let's say you have a healing circle group and you want to provide a very light refreshment or snacks for them, then that is allowable. But if you are providing food for trainings or conferences or anything that involves your peers, then that is not allowable with OVW funds. And then the second part of the question, can a program's advisory board raise funds to cover this cost? If the advisory board is not funded by OVW, if this is unrestricted funds that people that who aren't being compensated through the grant, that they're raising funds, I mean, you can spend unrestricted funds in the manner that you choose, and as long as the people who are raising those funds are not being paid for with OVW funds, then then they're raising unrestricted funds that can be paid for in that manner that you decide.
Okay, we'll take a couple more questions. Are incentives, i.e. gift certificates, gift cards, gas vouchers, for drug court participants allowed in the supplies category? And Chanel says, my question pertains to Purpose Area 3 and 8.
For that, I would recommend that you reach out to the program office to determine whether that is something that they will allow under that particular program. Because in most cases that I've seen, incentives are not allowable, but based on any type of justification, I'm not saying that a program office will not take that into consideration.
And I will chime in here. My name is Kara McDonough, and I do work with the program office of OJJDP with the Purpose Area 8 Healing to Wellness grants. And there are sometimes when incentives are allowable, but there needs to be a justification, and there needs to be some very clear calculations around exactly when the incentives would be offered and what they would be. And if they're going to be gift cards, there needs to be things in place to ensure that that there are adequate controls to keep them from being used inappropriately. And I can't speak for Purpose Area 3, which is the adult healing to wellness courts, but you would reach out to your program manager there if you were awarded.
Okay, we'll take one last question. Last year, when our budgets were submitted, the person who submitted the budget only uploaded the final page, so we were denied submission. Is this a common error?
I haven't seen that error before, I'll be honest. I thought that the document is protected, like the Excel spreadsheet, that it doesn't allow you to make any changes to it, so that surprises me. But I guess if you are a Purpose Area 5 grantee, you can contact your program specialist, and they will put you in contact with one of our GMS technical assistance specialists to help you out. Michael, if you want to talk for others.
I would not. I mean, I'm like you. I think I'm under the impression that when you submit the package, it's all inclusive. So I'm not sure how one page of it can be submitted and not the entire package.
Yeah, that sounds like it must have been a really strange glitch.
So I agree. Contact the program, the help desk, to see whether or not they can find out what actually went on. But that's the first I've heard of that. Yeah, that's the first I've heard of that.
All right, thank you, everybody. If we did not get to your question today, we do have a transcript of questions, and the ones that were not answered, you will get a response via email. And also, if the presentation is available for download in the presentation download pod, if you highlight the presentation and click upload file or download file, you have access to that. Also, the presenter contact information, if you have any further questions, you can contact the DOJ Response Center at tribalgrants@usadoj.gov, or you can call them 1-800-421-6770. And we also have a webinar survey for everyone to fill out today. It is also located at the bottom left-hand corner. If you highlight the link, you can click to browse to. Please fill that out for us. Let us know how we did today. And if you have any further questions, again, the presenter contact information, reach out to them. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
On the last question.